Welcome to Lesson 5, Creating Entities. So here we're going to show you how you can create new persistent data entities and wrap that with a service that can be used within the application. So what are the stages that need to be done? What do you need to do in order to do that? Well, the first thing you need to do is create new tables in the database itself. So this basically means creating the SQL statements that are needed for each particular table. And since we are going to be using our example CM user setup process, we have all these tables that we will need to create within the database. There's a type, there's a characteristic, there's a language, there's the transaction tables, gain characteristic as well, and log parameter tables. As well as doing that, we need to actually make sure that we grant permission to a sys user, because sys user is the user that is going to be using the system, is the login when we actually, the database login, when you actually when you log into the system, it's the database user that is being used. So you have to make sure that they have grant permissions, otherwise this won't work. So after you actually create all those tables, what you need to do next is go to the actual application and fill in for each of the tables all the information, all the fields that you've created in the database. You have to create all the metadata here as well. So you have to, in some sense, duplicate the work. So we have tables for all the user setup. So if I actually search for user, we will see we have all these tables, the type and the log tables and everything here. And for each one of these, we have to fill in all the different fields. And we have to fill in, for example, the Java table name. This is going to be very important because this name will actually match the entity name that I give for the class that I need to create for each table. And you will see that for each table that I create, you're going to have to create an entity, a Java class for. Very important also is all the constraints, all the primary key, as well as all foreign keys need to actually be defined here. If you make any mistakes here, you're going to have some problems when the SDK generates all the different classes necessary for the entities. It's going to be using and looking at this data in the database. So it's very important. If you make a mistake, spelling mistake, it will be found here. And until you get set, and most probably the most challenging thing for creating a new entity is just making sure that the tables and the naming is all correct. So, for example, here, the name that we have here is CM user setup proc. So now, if I actually go to my to Eclipse, you will see that we have a. Let's have a look where it is. The first table that I would actually create is this one, and you have an impl, which is the table name. It has the exact same name as what I defined in here, except for the only difference being that the first letter is capitalized. And you have all these annotations, and this can be done by creating and using the wizard that we have in the system, or actually taking another existing example and looking how a business entity is created. And we're going to have to create business entities for all the tables that we have. So we have a characteristic, we have logs, log parameters. In this case, I have put the package, we have transaction data in config tools, and we have an admin one for the type. So all this has to be defined carefully, each one making sure that we define the right annotations. And sorry, that's the wrong one. And you have to make sure that you have the correct one-to-many collections, child, and so on. As I said, this can be defined by using a wizard. The wizard I described in an earlier chapter lesson. So if I did an entity over here, I would be able to pick out, using these particular arrays, I can define the name. It will pick up the table automatically, and it will generate the annotations for me. Again, another option is just to copy an existing program and make the slight changes. I actually find that slightly easier than using the wizards. So after you've actually created all the different entities, you obviously have to create the, you have to run the generator. Because if I actually, going to one particular one again, if I actually just create my implementation class, then I will not have my generated class until I actually run the generate artifacts. And as we've described earlier, that once the artifact generator is run and you refresh, then if you look into your generated directory, you will see all those generated files, generated classes. And those generated classes there are quite a few different ones. There's one for an ID, there's one for generate, there's a DTO, all of them. And we don't go into great detail in terms of what each one means. We'll explain a little bit as we go along. But these are all important files, all different classes that are needed to support entities. After you've actually completed that step, there's one more that needs to be done in order to create a service, basically a wrapper service to create a maintenance object so that can be used within the application. So how do you do that? Well, that's a slightly different custom code. It's known, and normally we find those with the ending maintenance. If I have over here, you'll see there's a maintenance one right here, and you see that it's called an entity page maintenance, and it has again the connection between all the different tables and subtables which are involved in creating up the maintenance object. And again, once you've created that, you are going to actually run the annotation. You're going to create the generate the artifact builder again. And this service, the name here, is going to be very important because this service is actually what's being created and being used. And if I look into my generated class, I have under services now, I have a new service called SMUSP. And this is the service that I can now use within my application, within PSRM in my case. How does one use that? Well, if I go back to my application over here, if I go to service program, if I actually look up that program, CMUSP, you will see that I have one for the transactional, one for the type, and I have simply created metadata to correspond this service name to the name that I have in the service over here. Again, that service name is defined by whatever I put into my annotation on my maintenance class. So if I go back to my maintenance class one more time, you will see that that was the name, the service name. And I can define that wherever I want, but that has to match to this name over here. Once you have that, you can actually then create your maintenance object around that. So if I actually now look for my, I can look for my maintenance object. And you'll see that the maintenance object that I have has a service name, which is the service name that we just showed, the service program. And then you put in the tables that you actually created earlier, together with the roles as a primary table and the child tables and the constraints. And once you've actually have that all set up, you have now a usable maintenance object within the system that then can be used as you begin building your business object on top of it. So if I go back to my slide, let's just review the different steps that I just said. The first thing that you need to do is create new tables. You have to create new tables within the database itself, and the primary keys have to be defined as well. You don't have to actually create any of the constraints within the database. In fact, you only have primary keys in the database and nothing else. After that, you have to go to the application and add table metadata and define all the constraints there. And you have to make sure that the naming that you use for the Java names then are going to correspond to the names that you have for the entity classes that you create within Eclipse. And you're going to create basically one class for each particular table that you have in your that you've defined. Once you've created that, you're going to also create the service, creating the entity page maintenance, and it creates a service for you. And then you wrap that in the metadata with a service and a maintenance object within the application. Okay, so this corresponds really to the very first steps that you need to do. And you see, actually, even though you have to interact with Eclipse, you don't actually have to do very much work. You don't actually have to do much coding here. It's very much running wizards or copying data, and it's very straightforward. And as I sort of said before, if I go back to what we showed, the development cycle, this corresponds to the first thing that I mentioned before, database changes, that we need to do. And it's the first step that you need. And the skills needed are basically DBA administration, and that's it. And then when we come on to creating the maintenance object, what we saw is that we're running wizards and creating services, and that's basically as much as you need to do. Next lesson, we will also look at the change handlers that create the defaulting and validation, but even that, there's not too much coding. So if I just go forward now, just for 1 second again, what I wanted to show you is that we have, to just describe in a high level, summarize, use an example with person and person name, to show you that there is very little coding that one needs to do. One actually codes the implementation class for each entity. And as we saw, it automatically, using the wizard or copying, we need to have a generated file, which after running the artifact generator creates for you by itself. So even though there's many supporting classes that need to be done, the annotation, the artifact generator creates them for you, and we will be seeing how we use some of the other classes like the DTO later on and how they're going to be used.